lot of people attach their identities to the places they love to visit. So there was this clear need and a clear demand for, like, you would think of like the traditional NFT PFP, where it's meant to be a community identifier, where we saw the potential for creating that in the world of travel, but that identifier is one's experiences. So being not only able to identify oneself by the places that they've been, but being able to create community around a shared love of certain destinations in a way that creates more fruitful travel experiences at large. At the end of the day, why can't that be made digital, and why can't that be made better by doing so?
Today, we are delighted to be joined by Sam Simmons. Sam is the co-founder and CEO of MintPass, a Web3 travel companion app for collecting digital souvenirs that power a recommend-to-earn rewards ecosystem. Sam has been an investor, consultant, and advisor implementing Web3 and metaverse strategies for brands and IP holders. Today, we'll be talking to Sam about the world of Web3 travel and what MintPass is doing in this space. Sam, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate that intro. Could have said it better myself.
Sam, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Yeah, I'll speak for both of us. I think we're pretty good. We're very excited to have you on, actually. This is a really interesting topic that we're going to be talking about today, right? Web3 and travel. It's not something we've covered so far on the show. So yeah, I think this will be a really interesting episode for our audience. But before we get into all that, Sam, can you just give us a really brief background about you and your career and kind of what led you eventually into Web3?
Yeah, sure. So it's a long, winding, weird road to getting here, but I'll try to make it as concise as possible. So I'm based in Las Vegas, Nevada. As such, I worked in the gaming and media industry for a long time. So I formerly ran a company called Poker Go. We did streaming, production, distribution of live poker tournaments and events. And very clearly in the forefront for me, I was seeing the use case for crypto firsthand with cross-border payments. And frankly, a lot of poker players who may be over-indexed on the degen side, who were sending money back and forth very flippantly. But at the same time, there was a lot of value in that. And, seeing that at the forefront for me, like that made me crypto curious, if you will. Although I didn't do too much with it other than a little bit of investing on the side, set it and forget it type stuff. And then much like a lot of people in that early 2021 era when NFTs were popping off for a while there, I thought it was stupid at first, didn't do much with it. And then I started irresponsibly buying NFTs. And I think, like a lot of people, you don't really understand it until you get involved in it. And I started to join community, started to interact with people in the space. And there was really this aha moment for me of realization. Why, to be fair, to this day, I think a lot of the stuff that was happening then was very silly. But there was a realization of what could be in the form of these digital communities that were taking shape across the internet, and using NFTs as a validation mechanism for what was for me the use case of fandom. And it solved a lot of problems that I had in my former life professionally, considering my success metrics running a media network were in the form of the anonymity of concurrent viewers for streaming, and then even worse, TV ratings for broadcast, where we were spending 6-7 figure amounts on an annualized basis to create poker content without the ability to actually have the insights to tell us, wait, is this stuff working? Do people actually like this? Until after the fact, where if I could form this community of like verified poker fans, create that two-way relationship between brand and fan, and to be able to have that ongoing interaction, to be able to tailor the content to their liking, as well as to create this sandbox of interaction for these fans to be able to engage with one another, it was kind of this aha moment to say, where was this all this time when I needed it most? So I dropped everything I was doing, basically said, this is the future. I want to be involved in whatever this becomes, in whatever way it becomes, and started spending all my time in the space, like you said, doing consulting, advisory, and investing work. And that led me to create what MintPass is, which we'll talk more about through the session. But basically my thesis for creating MintPass, as well as everything else I do in this space, is anchored to why I got involved in the first place, which is bringing people closer to what they're most passionate about. And that was my inspiration of what can I do to create something cool around Web3 and NFTs, which brings people closer to that thing which they're most passionate about. And that, for the purposes of MintPass, is travel.
Got it. So I would definitely class you as somewhat of a crypto, or let's say Web3 veteran, right? Coming from the gaming industry and then moving into all these other elements, like, about community. Community is so important in Web3, I think. And I like that you identified that aspect of it before moving on to your current venture with MintPass. So what was it about the travel industry and that kind of whole experience that people have in the Web2 world that attracted you to kind of say, that's where I want to go and solve problems, right? What are the actual issues in that world of traditional travel that you're looking to address?
Yeah, it's a good question, and they could probably do a whole podcast on just this answer alone because there's a lot. What it actually started for me is, and I joke about it for those that are listening to the audio perhaps of this, I have a bookshelf behind me with a bunch of souvenirs on it. And for those that are watching, here's my souvenir bookshelf. But essentially, there was this clear behavior that we saw time and time again of physical collectorship tied to travel. And so that's not revolutionary necessarily, but what I had identified back in 2021, and there's a lot of themes that perhaps have aged in a good way, we've aged out of, but at the time coming out of COVID, when people weren't able to travel, what we found is that a lot of people attached their identities to the places they love to visit. And when they weren't able to visit those places, they lost a part of themselves in the process. So there was this clear need and a clear demand for like this, like you would think of like traditional NFT PFP, where it's meant to be a community identifier, where we saw the potential for creating that in the world of travel, but that identifier is one's experiences. So being not only able to identify oneself by the places that they've been, but being able to create community around a shared love of certain destinations in a way that creates more fruitful travel experiences at large. So that was the core thesis in all of this. And basically, how can we replicate the physical souvenir collectorship experience in a digital way while providing value around it? Because we can all agree and admit that like collecting souvenirs is great, but the utility of them is really non-existent. For that matter, the value of it is not the glass, the clay, the plastic that make up that physical item, but rather the memories that you associate with it. So at the end of the day, why can't that be made digital, and why can't that be made better by doing so? And so that's what we set out to do, and that's really what MintPass is. But along the way, what we've also found, and I would say what the real problem is in the Web2 travel space that we look to solve, is that not only do people long to collect their memories for the purposes of their own preservation, I should say collect experiences for the purposes of memory preservation, but they do it for the purposes of sharing with others as well. And so what we found to be interesting is we've identified this unique subset of traveler we think of as like travel tastemakers, which is the people who travel around the world and document their experiences along the way, not for the purposes of necessarily like flexing that or showcasing that in like traditional social media type of way, but it's more for the purposes of enabling experiences for others. So they're creating lists in Apple Notes and Google Sheets, taking pictures for their camera rolls, using tools like Google Maps to pin their hotspots across their travels on a per destination basis. And then when they have a friend that is maybe taking a trip to that same place, they have the ability to share that with them to create this sort of unique dynamic of a shared experience at different moments in time. So I have this restaurant that I went to, had an awesome time. I shared that with a friend taking a trip 6 months later. They have an awesome time there. Despite not having that time together, nor having any sort of incentive for me on the back end for having enabled that for them, we have this sort of synergy of having a shared experience at different moments in time. So how do we take that dynamic and make that scalable digitally? So the purposes of memory preservation are, yes, it's about just like the feel good, look at all the cool things that I've did and how can I share that effectively? But then the purposes of documentation for the enablement of others as well, we're trying to create an experience around that to make that whole experience more seamless.
That is a really interesting evolution. Like kind of the core value proposition from what you just said is around these digital souvenirs. And I think everyone who's traveled, you always collect a trinket and you put it on some shelf and it just collects dust. Like I've got one right next to me of all the places I've ever been, some pebbles, some rocks, all this kind of stuff. And like you say, you don't get that much value from it. Like for you, it's a personal experience. I can show it, and when I look at it, I remember it. But in this digital age where everything's convenient and everything's online, we want a way to also showcase those experiences and memories online. And then you talked about the shared experience. Now, this is, in my mind, I instantly go to reviews of places, reviews of countries, reviews of whatever. And when me and Jack have spoken about this previously, I think on the tokenization episode, maybe the micropayments episode, around the current Web 2 review platforms and how broken it is. Does MintPass, and we're going to talk about it a bit later, but does this kind of, the reasoning behind this and the USP behind this, does it fall into that broken kind of Web 2 review system paradigm that we're currently experiencing? And if it does, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, 100%. I think it for sure does. I wouldn't call ourselves a reviews platform per se, because I think inherently the incentives that are baked into the reviews process are broken. So I say that because if you think about like, what is the reason for someone to leave a review? I would venture to say, and I've had this experience myself, oftentimes it's not for the purposes of, I want to make sure that someone who comes here has an awesome experience. It's instead rather, I had a bad experience and I want to punish the restaurant so no one goes here. I hurt their business in a very direct way. Or on the flip side, this restaurant's offering me a free appetizer. If I check in and leave a review, I'll leave a positive review so I can get my free potato skins before my meal. So the point is, the actual output of that isn't necessarily someone else having this great meal or great tour or great stay at a hotel. It's rather the originator of that review wanting to feel better. I'll add to that as well, saying that there's clear data now that shows, specifically in travel, that a material amount of reviews are just entirely fake. A recent study out of, I think it's the Lufthansa Innovation Hub, found that 8% of reviews in travel are entirely fake, and that's up 400% from 2020 rates, which, as you can imagine, is largely due to, let's call it the Chat GPT era, or the post Chat GPT era, I suppose. So we've seen a 4x rise in fake reviews over the past just 4 years. And if you extend out that trajectory, all of a sudden reviews become less and less helpful over time. And besides that, like I said, like the incentives themselves aren't aligned to what actually matters, which is great experiences in travel. So that's where we want to fix things, in that the output of value associated with what we're trying to create is tied to enabling a positive experience for someone. So the value isn't necessarily like, here's the thing I did and here's what I say about it, but the value is doing that and then someone else taking you up on that, having a good experience, and then having that trace back to you. And there's a whole architecture around like the dissemination of word of mouth recommendations and how we trace that, how we quantify the value of that within the context of an ecosystem like this, which we may or may not get to in full today. But doing so, like, I think it all goes back to incentive alignment for me. Like, how do we reward what we ultimately want, which is people having great times in travel, as opposed to incentivizing the typical polarization that you would see in the reviews landscape?
I think that resonates with me, and I imagine a lot of our listeners as well. Like the amount of reviews I see on Amazon or TripAdvisor, and you're like, surely half of these aren't real. Like I bought some product, I can't remember what it was. I think it's like a USB adapter or something like this, and it had 5-star reviews, 20,000 reviews. Used it, I bought it. It was broken within 10 seconds. I left a negative review. The person who I bought it from contacted me saying, "I'll give you a free refund if you remove that review." And obviously, being selfish, I was like, "Yeah, of course I am." And that is the fact that plays out. Whereas I think the stat is like 95% of people, before they buy a product or service, will check the online reviews, but 70% don't trust the reviews that they're reading and then know there's fakes in those reviews. And I think a point that you just raised, which is really interesting and important in this space, is it also matters who's doing the reviewing, right? Like if two people review some restaurant and one is, say, a local and another is a tourist who's been there once, like whose review do you care more about? It's probably going to be the local. And this is something that I think hopefully you're going to talk about a little as well, because I think that's really important to this space, and probably what MintPass does as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say like that not all reviews are created equal. And I think consider the source comes into play heavily here. So on part one, yeah, I think reviews in and of themselves are skewed by the context in which the review is output. And by that I mean, and this is something I've encountered many times as an American going over to Europe, for example, where culturally the experience of dining and engaging with the local region is inherently different from what you'd expect in the US. And oftentimes a negative review is rooted in one's expectations tied to the regionality from which they derive. To simplify that, if I'm an American and I go over to Europe to have, and like my first trip to Europe, and I'm having a meal and I don't get service in the first 15 minutes, that's bizarre for me coming in with the lens of being an American. But over there, like that makes sense. Like you would normally have to like ask and say, hey, we're ready to put in drinks or something like that. So what I found is in my own trips, now that I've been over there several times, you can almost identify which reviews are with that perspective in mind, like when they are tied to crappy service. And you'll also find that the local mom and pops, unlike the USB vendor that you had bought that from, could care less about people reviewing on TripAdvisor. Like they're there to provide optimal service in a physical way on site. They're not like gaming TripAdvisor to optimize their reviews and ultimately bring in more traffic that way. So the point is, I've seen places that have had like 3.5 stars, but I've had a friend who went there and had a great time there recommend them to me, and I'm willing to forego the review site because I much prefer the context of a friend who I know and trust, having had that experience and having enjoyed it. And thus, I'm willing to perhaps take the plunge with a lesser reviewed restaurant than I otherwise would be. So I think that's a key component in this. And then that segues into the second point, which is exactly as you say, consider the source context is key, where if let's just simplify the example, let's say I have two friends who make me a recommendation for an Italian place in New York. If I see one of them has been to New York 100 times and has been to this Italian place 80 times versus one friend who took one trip to New York and happened to find this one place across the street from the hotel and said it was good, they both could be good places, but I would probably favor the former of the two a bit more, having had someone who's a theoretically expert on the region, has frequented a place a bunch of times. Similarly to the aforementioned example, if there's someone who's been to Europe 20 to 30 times from the US as opposed to had just gone for their first time, like creating this sort of social graph tied to reviews, if you will, is what we're trying to create here, and providing context where it doesn't exist on other platforms.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I think you're getting at this whole idea of kind of word of mouth. It's actually kind of a very, very Web3 concept, right? It's this peer-to-peer idea of sharing experiences. And I do think, especially in the last 10 years or so, the culture around how you recommend things has completely changed, because now I know plenty of people, myself included, who will, be taking their travel recommendations, even things like food, what to cook. I don't go on a large recipe book or website anymore. I just go on Instagram and find a recipe that looks really nice, got it linked. So the whole model, I think, has been changed by social media. Do you think some of the challenges that still exist in the travel space generally, are they Web2 specific, and do you think they've kind of been made worse in any way by the rise in the digital platforms we have now in the Web2 world?
That's a great question. Where my mind goes first, I don't think it's necessarily good or bad. I think it's just the reality of the society that we live in. I think that social media in general incentivizes a degree of, at best, inauthenticity, at worst, fabrication of one's experiences. Like it's less about the nature of the experience, more about your presentation of that experience. And that's good and bad. And I understand there's value around that. Like people's attention spans are valuable and no one wants to look at crappy content. So the algorithms and the incentive mechanisms are tied to how you portray your content to be beautiful, clever, funny, emotional, whatever the trigger might be. But I think, again, this is actually a good point, and it, in a similar way but different, applies to the same sort of misaligned incentives of typical review sites. I think that like modern social media and recommendation sharing is a different kind of incentive misalignment, where oftentimes let's call them influencers on social media that you might see, I find that the incentive that they have to promote something is not necessarily tied to you having that experience as well and being able to go yourself, but oftentimes it may be wanting to portray how something looks, wanting to portray the great experience they're having, whether they are or not, and or for that matter, being contractually obligated to promote a brand deal. So their incentive is not necessarily to create a positive experience, but for you just to create experience in the form of a conversion of you booking with like a hotel partner or something, for that example. So there's always more than meets the eye behind the scenes. And again, I'm not here to say whether that's good or bad or pontificate about the nature of social media and the current Web2 landscape. I personally, and this is something that I've discovered in having worked in this space a lot over the past year, like I don't love that type of inspiration. Like I don't really want to see, frankly, like someone scantily clad, shirtless, posing on the beach on a sunset and being like, look at me, this is my life, can you believe it? Now follow me and click my link tree to book a hotel with my promo code. That's not helpful.
That's what we need to start doing, I think, Jack. That's what we need to start doing to promote this podcast.
Exactly. You probably get a lot of likes. But all that being said, like what I value most is like what my friends hit me up and tell me and about what to do when they travel. And I did this. I'm going to be in Europe in 10 days, traveling across Berlin, Spain, and Paris on the way back out. And that's the first thing I did is I posted an Instagram story and asked my friends like, "Hey, I'm heading to these cities. What should I be doing?" And then I reach out to some directly who I know have been there. "Hey, do you have a list for this spot?" And that, as I described that experience, that in of itself is the part that's broken, right? Is like actually having to go through all that time and effort to circumvent how everyone else gets their travel tips, so to speak, via like blogs, TripAdvisor reviews, traditional influencers, explore pages, and go through this real headache of a process of like, all right, who of my friends has been somewhere that I'm going to? Do they have a list? Where do I find those things in comparison to my hotel? All these other things you have to go through in the research process. We're trying to consolidate that and basically take the part of travel planning that provides the most value and put that all in a singular place while creating the incentive mechanisms around why you should be contributing to that. And that's through the reward structure of rewarding ecosystem participants who share their travels with us and thus bring in basically their experiences to feed this larger inspiration network tied to word of mouth recommendations.
Okay, so you started to hint at what MintPass is there, and I guess it seems a bit like maybe a social media platform. It's not a review service, but it's combining these two different elements to talk about like the authentication of individuals and their experience, so that you can actually derive value from it in terms of what you should do. But could you kind of really go into what's the core value proposition of MintPass and what's its mission within the Web3 travel ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. So the platform, it's what we liken it most to as an experience is a mix of like Foursquare with Pokemon Go. So you travel around the world, and unlike the traditional like manual check-in flow, it's like a gamified mechanism of digital souvenir collectorship. And as you travel, you collect these things tied to where you go and what you do. So you can build this travel profile that says just that, where you've been and what you've done while there, where you eat, where you play, where you stay, whatever you do, this gets like builds this larger travel narrative around one's experiences. And the whole point is to again be an answer to the inauthenticity around travel inspiration where it lives today across Web2 platforms. So consider review sites, consider social media. And we're not necessarily trying to replace that, but we want to be a direct outlet for the aspect of that people value most, which is legitimize recommendations from travelers that you trust. And what we see in the market is that 84% of travelers made their last travel decision based upon a word of mouth recommendation from a trusted traveler. But like we talked about already through the session, like you think about where you access that, it really doesn't exist yet. It's all offline, it's all peer to peer. And for that matter, it's reliant on people doing a lot of legwork to preserve these things to be able to share with others in the future. So we basically want to make that process of not only aggregating the information on a personal level more seamless, but then being able to more effectively share that with others. And then again, creating the incentive structures via a tokenized reward system that allows you to get some sort of benefit output from having enabled a great experience for someone else. So there's a lot to unpack within all of that. But basically, if you look at the Web3 sides of this in particular, you have the digital souvenir collectorship side, which is like the verification input. So in a gamified type of way, collect digital artifacts tied to one's experiences. Think of like travel-based POAPs, basically, tied to the things you do when you travel. And then there's a whole network around discovery and sharing that's comprised with that. And then we allow booking at the point of inspiration. So basically, I'm planning a trip to London. My friend sends me their MintPass profile, specifically like a London deep link that shows everything that they've done. They stayed at this great hotel when they were there. I booked that hotel for myself. And this just gets into the business model side, which people may or may not care about. But there's an affiliate transaction that happens on our back end, which drives revenue back to the business, which we can then redistribute back to the community via this tokenized reward structure. So it's like a verification input, tokenized reward output to create this all-encompassing holistic marketplace of travel inspiration, if you will, tied to word-of-mouth travel recommendations.
Okay, that was going to be my follow-up question. So you use this term like NFT digital souvenirs, and they're linked to the reward system, right? So say, for example, I as a traveler, I'm always around London, and you're visiting London next week, Sam, and you go to my favorite restaurant, which isn't really on Google reviews, it's called Senviet. Absolutely love the place. I'll share my MintPass account with you, or some details related to my MintPass account. Effectively, there'll be a link of your usage if you go to that restaurant then to my NFT that's for that restaurant. And if you actually go there and purchase something, for example, I will then be rewarded for your usage of that service. Is that how it works?
Correct. And there's a lot of mechanics within that remain to be seen. So like, who are the partnerships involved with like reservation flow? How do we confirm that the booking happened and the meal happened and that it was paid for versus like a restaurant cancellation? Which partners are within that? But I also think there's something to be said just around the, like, I think we could probably just quantify that. Like, if I see that and I save it to my list, and then we can somehow track that I made a reservation, even at a small level, like that means something. And so there's actually something, there's a critical factor in this that you have to bear with me, because I can get like conspiracy theory whiteboard with how I think about this, because it can get complicated, but I'll try to keep it as simply as possible. We think of like the pyramid of recommendation flow, where, what was the restaurant name that you just mentioned?
Sen Viet. It's in King's Cross, best Vietnamese restaurant in London.
Sen Viet. Okay, Sen Viet. So let's say, let's consider it a hidden gem. I don't know how popular it may or may not be, but for the sake of the example, let's call it a hidden gem. You go there for the first time, you're like, holy cow, this is the best restaurant ever. I have to add this to my profile as you're on a trip. So you authenticate that you went there based upon the geolocation tracking that we have, and then get started this digital souvenir. Let's say you go there more times, let's say you don't, but you curate this into your profile to say like, that's your number one place you have to go to when you're in London. So then you share that with 3 other people like myself, who then make a trip to London, and I go there as well. I'm like, holy cow, he was right. This is the best restaurant in London. Now I add to my recommendations list. And so I then send 3 people there, and then they do the same thing. So you can see where this goes. And all of a sudden you're 3 layers deep into this example. Let's say each person tells 3 friends who then take them up on that recommendation. That's 27 people that you've enabled this great experience for, as the pyramid goes further and further down the recommendation flow, which all ties up back to you. So basically, like, with some degree of certainty, let's say, whether we know that they paid for food there or not, but let's say they add it to their wish list of their London itinerary, and then they go there, and we could see geographically they're in the restaurant based upon their phone logging, which is how we authenticate things, and then they add it to their list. Like, they probably had a meal there, and thus you should get recognized for having enabled that experience for them based upon providing the recommendation. So not only is it about like you to me telling me to go there, and then I go there, great, we all had a positive experience, but then it's the people that I send there, and it's the people that those people send there. And it's like how a recommendation compounds over time, all powered by your discovery of that recommendation in the first place. So there's really interesting dynamics around that. And like, there's a lot of partnerships to be had with booking operators, hotels, tour operators, dining reservation partners, and so on and so forth, to create the seamless flow of like discovery to making that actionable. But all that being said, we don't really have to rely on that either. Like, if we can see that someone had an intent to go there and then they ended up logging that they went there, then we could say that they did that thing, and thus there should be a reward for it.
One of the things that you mentioned that's quite interesting is the link between what happens in the physical world and the actual NFT in the digital world, right? And how you make that connection. It's quite tricky, right? And I think, not to ideate live on there, just in case it goes wrong, but I guess imagine in like 10 years' time, when crypto is everywhere and everyone's using crypto to interact and exchange, like the ideal workflow would be, I pay for my food using crypto, which is logged on chain so you can see it. And in return, I get the food plus an NFT that's issued by the restaurant using, say, MintPass's service, and then you can actually provably say, okay, well, you really did purchase, and that purchase is on chain, the NFTs on chain, all the history's locked up there. It's like a golden age of kind of authenticated experience, right?
Yeah, you could take this out to the nth degree in so many different use cases, that being a key one. And that would be ideal for us, is to have like on-site verification mechanism for like the most confirmed of confirmed confirmation. But yeah, it'll obviously take time to get there, and there's a lot of user adoption that has to happen between now and then. So like, frankly, what I feel like a lot of Web3 projects don't do today, what we want to do is make this as seamless as possible for Web2 users to utilize. We want this to feel like a traditional travel sharing experience, as opposed to a hardcore crypto experience that happens to be tied to travel. And if we all believe that like Web3 will become more and more prevalent over the next decade as user adoption continues to accelerate, then we have faith that we get there eventually. But we're also not in a hurry to do so necessarily, because we feel like we have the experience today that provides value, irregardless of what that landscape looks like in the short to midterm future.
Yeah, and I think I actually recognize that kind of outlook and philosophy from your website. I went on mintpass.com, and I think the element that it is a Web3 project is kind of muted a little bit, which I think is really smart, because at the end of the day, the value proposition is not about Web3 necessarily. That's just the infrastructure. That's the tooling that's enabling you to realign incentives in the way you're talking about, to be able to share these experiences, enable the recommendation system to work. I am curious though, because we're a Web3 podcast, I'd love to know a little bit more about the detail of, exactly what are the Web3 components underneath all this. You hinted at NFTs, maybe being used for the digital souvenirs piece, but I'd be interested, at what point is your system interacting with the blockchain, with other elements of Web3? And also, do you think it could be what you're trying to do? Do you think it's uniquely enabled by Web3, or do you think this couldn't be solved otherwise if we didn't have all these tools at our fingertips now?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the second question. I think it's an important point to make is like what we do not want to do, and having been around the space for a while now, what I've seen time and time again work out unsuccessfully is like, let's take X use case and launch it for Web3, when in fact X use case didn't require Web3 or in whatever way wasn't broken in the first place, where it was like, let's just utilize buzzy technology for the sake of utilizing buzzy technology, whether or not that buzzy technology actually made experiences better. So we don't want to do that, first and foremost, and we're looking to only integrate the Web3 elements as it provides value to the user, or to your point, like it lays the infrastructure that is necessary for us to do what we want to do with the experience that we're creating. So then to the earlier point in regards to like, what are the Web3 rails that this lives on top of? So the NFT element for sure on digital collectorship, and I think that's tied to the verification of one's experiences, where you go, what you do, and creating that digital footprint tied to one's travels. I think outside of just recommendation sharing as well, I think there's a matter of like future, let's say, travel customization tied to one's experiences, and like interoperability comes into play there, to use like a Web3 value add. So how can I take my MintPass experiences and bring this over to this loyalty program, that loyalty program, this hotel concierge, to say, here's who I am as a traveler and here's what I like to do, powered by my past experiences. It's all proven on the record. So what can you do for me because of what I'm willing to give to you in the form of my traveler data? And if you look at the travel landscape today in Web 2, it's a landscape made up of a bunch of walled garden loyalty programs. And that's kind of frustrating for me as a user to say, like, who I am with Marriott doesn't talk to who I am with Hyatt, who doesn't talk to who I am with Hilton, let alone who I am with United Airlines, let alone with Delta Airlines, and so on and so forth, where I have like these fragmented personas of small parts of who I am as a traveler that live with these various partners. And there's no incentive for these partners to share that with one another, despite doing so, bringing value back to the user in more customized experiences. So in a future reality that we see, we have this sort of interoperable data presence where your travel logging can be ported into different ecosystems as more of these partners integrate the Web3 strategies that a lot of them have in mind today. And that can create enhanced customization, enhanced benefits, all the things that we value when it comes to personalized travel. So that's part one. And to that end, like, interoperability doesn't happen without the Web3 element. So that's an important building block for us to start working on today. And then getting into the output of like reward structure, this is probably the biggest question mark for us, is like, what does that reward structure look like? Obviously, you could look at, not to get too technical, but you could look at like a true ERC20, like straight token, which could entail an airdrop in the future. That is not me saying or promising an airdrop. That's, for the record, there's no airdrop plan. This is not financial advice. Nothing I say should ever be used against me for any of those similar reasons. But it's one of them. It's one of the menu of options. I think there's also a great narrative building around like on-chain points currently, and I see that as like this sort of intermediary step between like the hardcore ERC20 token drop, which I personally don't love, because then whether it's supposed to or not, the value of your project is inherently tied to the value of your token, where if your price goes down, there's an automatically negative perception tied to your brand because of it for those who are bag holders, which I think sets, again, is not optimal for incentive alignment. So I love the concept of on-chain points for redemption, perhaps, where it's in a bit in a way like it's like Web 2.5-ish to me, of like, it feels like a traditional loyalty program, but users have control of their points in such a way that they don't elsewhere, while we retain a sense of control over the ecosystem to dictate how those points can or cannot be redeemed on a per promotion, per benefit basis, so that we don't break the economy before it gets started and then end up in a difficult spot down the road because of it. So all that combined, I think like the tokenized rewards piece is an important one as well, of giving, and it's the answer to the traditional loyalty. Like, I feel like every other week I'm seeing some airline changes their loyalty program and every user within that gets screwed. So wanting to provide like a true Web3 sort of benefit package off the back of this is then the other part of it. And then this is not necessarily like a super compelling use case, but just something that I personally feel strongly about based upon my own experiences. looking at like the permanence of one's travel experiences and where that lives today. And we found that a lot of people have like their most coveted travel memories tied to their Instagram pages or like other centralized platforms. And I'm not saying that there's a real risk of Instagram ceasing to exist tomorrow, but when I've talked to people who have been traveling for the past 50, 60 years and they're older now, and like oftentimes if you were to ask them like the story of their lives, oftentimes to the places they go and the things that they do. And who knows if these things will be in existence in 50, 60 years time, where like we can adequately and properly convey the depth of our memories at that point. So I think the permanence of one's experiences, I think, is, while kind of like a nice to have feel good narrative, I think it's an important one. And the digital identity aspects that can be derived from that can't be ignored. So that's the last one I'd throw in.
I really love that description. And I think through all three of those kind of themes, I actually think the interoperability piece you mentioned first pervades them all, right? You have interoperability between the siloed providers you currently have in the traditional travel world, where they're not sharing databases. It's very hard to take your loyalty from one platform to another. You have the transfer of value piece, and that also being interoperable, right? Because if you earn points in one program, you want to be able to spend them in another, right? Just because you're a good traveler, it doesn't matter where you're traveling or who you're with necessarily. And then in that third piece as well, I think interoperability is still very key to the whole experience. You mentioned use cases there. One that's really springing to my mind, because I think we've spoken a lot of this from the perspective of travelers and how you spread word of mouth and improve the experience for the individual. But I can also imagine this is really highly applicable to governments and countries as well, who want to promote tourism and also have that aspect of cultural preservation. You mentioned preserving an individual's travel history, but also how do you preserve the culture of a country? Well, you do it through travel, you do it through promoting sites of cultural significance. And a lot of the time, I think when you travel, you go to the 2 or 3 that everyone knows about, but you'll miss the 100 other really interesting places that you can now hear about through your system. Is that another angle that you are interested in? Is that something you're targeting, this kind of cultural preservation piece for countries and things like that?
Yeah, I think cultural preservation is a big thing. I think there's a larger challenge with some of the major hotspots for tourism around like over tourism, where if you go to a certain like landmark destination, you have a top 3 to 5 things that everyone feels like they have to do. And thus everyone does them and everyone does them at the same time. And everyone has a miserable experience along the way because of it's 80% humidity off the coast of the Mediterranean in the middle of the summer. And we're all packed into this like old cathedral without air conditioning and standing shoulder to shoulder with one another. Like we're here because we all have to do this while we're here, but we all hate it while we're here because we're all here at the same time. And it's like, how do we diffuse some of that traffic? And so back to like cultural preservation, how do we like not overload the local economy and local cultural landmarks with all this foot traffic, while also enabling for more authentic experience discovery while you're there, in a way like diffusing the traffic to other areas that are of equal or similar value, but just maybe a little bit like more off the beaten path, so to speak. So there's groups that specialize in basically this effort called DMOs, which are destination management organizations, which like we see as a key partner for us as we go along, where like what I most simply think of it as, like, how do we use like gamified scavenger hunts as sightseeing experiences, where like I touch down in Barcelona and here, like, welcome to Barcelona, this is me using MintPass, welcome to Barcelona, like here are the 10 sort of like bonus activities where if you do these things you get 2x points tied to your traveler score, which is like basically the metric tied to the extent of your travels via your MintPass profile. And so you go do those 10 things, you get your bonus points, and there's like maybe sort of other benefits to be unlocked, like, collect digital art NFTs from local artists of Barcelona. Maybe it's local business discounts where you can go collect this NFT and get 20% off this authentically local meal at this mom and pop down the street from your hotel. All these things where it's like you have fun doing them and you kind of say, wait, I just saw Barcelona. And you do it in the way that like we design and tailor for you, in partnership with the local regionality, the local officials who obviously have a certain wish list of how they want to prioritize, emphasize, diffuse some of the tourism behaviors as they exist today. So that's very much a part of it. And I think it's this sort of rare win-win-win across tour operators, local businesses, DMOs, and our users, where like everyone stands to benefit from something like that. And then to the first point, like it ultimately stands to preserve the culture itself of not being in that spot where everyone's at the same place at the same time, while the facilities themselves then are damaged along the way because it's over trafficked and everything else. So it's fun stuff like that. It's on the roadmap, and it's all will play out in due time.
That's a perfect kind of inroad to the roadmap, because it's all of these things sound great. I mean, that in itself, going to a tourist hotspot, which is always the top of TripAdvisor, and seeing a million people in the space of 5 seconds, like, it ruins it, right? I can imagine like government incentives to try and push people, give them discounts if to try and get away from the central tourist hubs, and that comes down to the authenticated users, right? Locals don't go to those tourist hotspots, right? They have their own little gems, like you said earlier. And so the question I have here is, where's MintPass at right now? Like, I'm looking online on the website and there's an option to join the waitlist. Where are you at now?
Yeah, so we're actually this week launching, or we've been in the process of launching. These things are never as easy as they sound, but launching our alpha program. So we have a limited list of testers in there currently. We're going to be opening up beta next month, which will be on an ordering to the waitlist that's available on our website, mintpass.com. And then we're going to launch fully in April. And so that was the right time to get in. I think, to your point regarding the roadmap, like, I think of it as like a decision tree of different possibilities across different use cases. So I think there's sort of like the on-site use case. I think there's the rewards use case. I think there's like a concierge use case of like customization of one's travel provider experiences powered by your past data. I think there's something there. And not all can happen at the same time. And frankly, not all will happen in eventuality. So much of what we find most valuable today is just feedback of like, what are the pain points that people are having and how can we make them better? Our bet is that the data that's being provided to us in a way that the user controls can solve a lot of the problems that people have in travel. And if we do it in a Web3 type of way, it unlocks potential that doesn't exist in the space today. So it's just a question of like, what are the most pressing issues that various, not only travelers have, but then key stakeholders in travel have, like the DMOs that we talked about, OTAs, online travel agencies, the big booking partners. So all these different players we're involved in conversations with, and we're trying to identify like kind of where we fit into the mix and where we provide the most value, and then letting that guide the use cases that we pursue with the highest priority.
That makes sense. I think just to take a quick, not step back, but step forward maybe, to look at the future. And I've got 2 questions here. We've kind of talked about, where MintPass is at right now, and you've given us a little bit of insight as to where you think it's going. But if you were to look ahead in 10 years' time, what would you like to achieve with MintPass? What would be the goal there? And also, the second question is a bit more, outside of the world travel. You could in the Web3 space in different areas right now. You talked about metaverse and all these kind of things. Is there anything you're particularly excited about the future of in Web3 outside of travel as well?
Yeah, so part one, in regards to like 10 years in the travel space, my dream, which actually I've never really said this out loud nor thought of, I just kind of had the idea just now. What I think of as social proof in booking travel experiences, and in its first form, that would exist as like an isolation in a sense on our platform, but we want to be compatible with traditional social. So like for the tastemakers I alluded to earlier, like our goal is to sort of make this as like must-have type of link tree where here's the window shopping of my Instagram feed, all the cool stuff I'm doing along the way. But if you want to like deep dive my experiences and more importantly, book these experiences for yourself, check out my MintPass profile. And that incentivizes the originator of that via the person who has the Instagram page and so on and so forth. But then thinking like how we partner with, we would never say that like TripAdvisor is a competitor of ours. And in fact, we see our offering as vastly different from what TripAdvisor provides. And as someone booking a trip to Europe in the current moment, like I am very much still using TripAdvisor to plan my trip. Like what they provide is very valuable, but like there's also no way in which TripAdvisor can retrofit their offering to be what we are either. So I can imagine an experience where like you're browsing through TripAdvisor and maybe you see, to simplify it, a MintPass widget that says Bob, Mary, and Joe have all stayed at this hotel. Here's what they have to say. Like providing like from your network, or 80% of travelers like you had a great time at this hotel, or 68% of travelers who also enjoyed this hotel in France also enjoyed this. So you can see where I'm going with this, where it's like who I am as a traveler, I can take with me to all these different travel experiences to provide greater customization and curation, not only for myself, but then powered by my network. And then tying that all together to create a more cohesive booking experience at large, where what I'm in many cases investing a lot of money into, I just generally feel better about, because there's a certain authenticity to it. I keep using the word, I feel like it's cliche, but a certain like authenticity layer that doesn't exist in the current travel planning landscape, where you're just basically relying on the anonymity of all these people reviewing these sites. And it's like, okay, well, enough people have said it's good, I'm gonna have to trust that. But if I'm able to like tie in my friends to say these people I know said that it's good, that changes the picture for me. So that's where I'd love to get to. As far as the Web3 space at large, I'm trying to like off top and think of like a specific example. This is the cynic showing in me, but I kind of like to talk about what gets me most excited is what doesn't get me excited, which is like the same stuff over and over again. I think like what a lot of people are looking at is like in this vague mix of like ticketing, gaming, loyalty. Like I see the same rinse and repeat use cases over and over again. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm of the opinion that like Web3 gaming is not what's gonna lead to mainstream adoption. And for that matter, like no play to earn experience or play and earn, whatever the working terminology would be, has really compelled me with like a fun game. And so I don't love that. I think that's a lot of people would probably say is something like that, but I would differ from that. The narrative that I talk about not only for MintPass but other things a lot is like the NFTs is a mechanism to bring people closer to what they're passionate about, like I said earlier. But like I just think we have to build stuff around what people actually care about. And I don't think we're doing that today, really. I think a lot of it is like, here's this really cool technology, and if we bet on people adopting this over time, like I'm going to build this now, and then as they adopt, they'll become users to a platform like this. But I don't think we can wait that long. Like I'd rather build to where they are and where they're spending time, and that's what we're trying to do, obviously, in travel with MintPass. There's a great loyalty offering, a loyalty platform that's doing like a lot of beauty products now. And I just at Web3 loyalty, but I'm going to then acknowledge it as like a great example. But they're doing Selena Gomez's beauty brand, whose name I forget. I want to give it a proper plug as I'm talking about it. But the point of it is no one who's using it realizes that it's an NFT that they're engaging with, or realize that it's Web3. So that's probably what I'm most bullish on, which isn't like that hot of a take to say like the use cases that are best are those that aren't even like really Web3 use cases, because no one actually realizes they're engaging with Web3, and thus they're not the use cases that like the talking heads of Web3 are all talking about. That's where I hope to position ourselves. We're not like a buzzy sort of narrative around like 3 or 4 months ago, it was friend tech, like, oh, it's going to change the world. I think right now, and I have nothing but good things to say about Farcaster, but right now it is Farcaster. Like that's the talk of the town, and all the Web3 people are congregating there. But I don't think that necessarily replaces crypto Twitter either. And like, I don't see the use case of just using both as particularly compelling. So I think like where the real valuable platforms will show themselves in the next 3 to 5 years once they've grown and scaled, and it's like, wait, this was Web3 the whole time. It's like that, like the astronaut meme of like, wait, this is a Web3 project, and the guy behind him like always has been, buddy. And so that's what gets me most excited, is like the kind of like, wait, that's really cool. They're doing stuff with Web3 and no one realizes it. That's what's cool.
Yeah, I love that outlook. I think that the whole kind of Trojan horse, but for the good idea is nice, right? You want to use Web3 for what it's good for, where it provides the end goal of having a better customer experience. And yeah, I 100% agree. In a few years' time, people will look back and then think, oh, okay, I've been a Web3 user for 5 years and I didn't even know about it. I think that's definitely the right approach. And I also want to just touch on something you mentioned there to kind of round out the conversation, because we started talking a lot about the reviews problem and the misalignment of incentives around reviewing. And I think what I've taken from this conversation is that maybe MintPass is almost solving for that kind of reputation identity system, that problem that you have around reviews. Because I think that the ultimate solution for reviews is going to be a combination of a few things, one of them being that reputation or identity. So I think that's definitely something I've taken away. So Sam, it's been a really, really interesting conversation for me. We're coming to the end now. There's two kind of standard questions we love to ask all our guests to compare answers between and see how they change over time. So if you're ready, I'm going to fire the first one of those at you. So in one sentence, what is Web3 to you?
Digital ownership. I'll save your sentence and I'll give you 2 words. Digital ownership.
Nice. You missed the first opportunity to be a 2-word answer very recently, but I'm glad we've got another one, because sometimes they're much longer. So that was beautiful. Brilliant. So the second question then is, if you could choose anybody, they can be alive on the planet now from throughout history, or they could even be fictional, to sit down and have a discussion about Web3 with, who would you pick and why?
I wish I had like a groundbreaking answer here. I would say Thomas Jefferson. And I think this is something, I know it's a weird one. And this is where my mind went first. Like, I think the nature of like decentralized networks are a very American concept at its core. And like when we launched the United States, like the 13 colonies, and sort of like how like these sort of network states came to be in a very sort of offline, obviously traditional sense. and you parallels the themes of like early America into what Web3 has become. I think there's a lot of interesting parallels. I think it'd be cool to just like, hey, here's where we got, and here's like this new technology that we have to offer. And there's obviously a lot between then and now to catch them up to speed on for that to all make sense. But I think at the same time, I think like a lot of society's gotten away from that. So I think it'd be just interesting to just, pontificate on the state of the world then versus now, and how perhaps the world that he lived in, like we call Web3 this new and novel thing, but like the concepts that are comprised within it are not new nor novel. And I think it'd be cool to just riff on like what once was and what we're trying to create, what will be.
That's a good answer. Like I recently watched Hamilton on West End and went down a rabbit hole of like the founding fathers. I found it really interesting. But yeah, Thomas Jefferson was one of the things I was researching at like 2 a.m. in the morning, the night off. But yeah, this has been a really incredible episode. Like I, for one, am extremely excited about the future of Web3 travel thanks to this. Yeah, thank you for joining us, Sam. And thank you to those listening wherever you may be. And join us next time as we untangle a little more of Web3. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3, produced by Emma Camilleri.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.